Hey, good morning. It's Jason again from Fraser Valley Rose Farm. Here I am on my farm on a cloudy, rainy, dreary morning, but I'm using it to prune roses, and I thought it might be high time for me to make a video going through some of the most common rules that are quoted in teaching beginners how to prune roses. So I've picked the 7 most common rules and guidelines, and let me be straight here, I think these rules and guidelines are intended to be helpful to simplify the process for people who are a little nervous about pruning their roses, but without context, they can also be a little bit confusing. So I've chosen the top 7 here. I'm going to go through them one by one and tear them apart a bit, give you the reasons why the rules are there, and also tell you whether I agree with them or disagree with them. Stick around, you will learn how to prune roses along the way, I promise. So the first of those rules is to prune your roses when the Forsythia is in bloom. And Forsythia is this yellow shrub, and I'll include a picture of it in the landscape as well. But this yellow shrub blooms early in the season. Most temperate climates, it's one of the earliest things in bloom, but it's not the only thing in bloom at this time of year. So you can see here, this is my Japanese quince. This here is a Juneberry or Saskatoon. They're all in bloom at this time of year. And the idea behind this rule is to tell you when the beginning of the pruning window opens, sort of to remind you to look at nature or follow nature. The plants, the early blooming shrubs, sort of are signaling to you that nature has decided it's time to come out of winter and that it's safe to put on those blooms and that they won't die back due to a late frost. Do I think this is a good rule? Well, yeah, sort of. I mean, it's good to listen to nature, but nature can be wrong. I've seen pears bloom early, I've seen peaches bloom early and have their blooms knocked off by frost before. So it's not a perfect rule, but it does get you paying attention to when the beginning of the blooming season is. Now, the other thing I will say about this rule is that the pruning season, in my view, extends much longer than this. This only signals the very beginning of the pruning season. So in my climate, here on the west coast of Canada, that happens somewhere in the middle of March, late March, and goes all the way through. I don't stop structural pruning of my roses until, say, August. So I have a 6-month period where I can do structural pruning on my roses and not do too much harm to them for the following seasons. So, you know, it's only the beginning that it's signaling. And the other thing I will say is there are sometimes good reasons to wait. Certainly, if you don't have time at the beginning of the season, fine, wait until later. Second thing is that some roses are once blooming and some roses bloom repeatedly throughout the season. The once blooming roses, if you prune them too early, you'll forego your flowers for that season. So if you don't know what your roses are, or if you know that they're once bloomers or species roses, wait until after the first bloom to prune them. If they're repeat blooming, you can take advantage of that whole window and not sacrifice too much in the way of blooms. All right, the second rule for pruning roses for beginners is to start with dead, diseased, damaged, or crossing stems. And this is an important rule and a good one, because if you're a beginner, the last thing you want to do is do damage to your roses. You want to end up with a better rose than you started with. And by focusing on the dead material, the diseased, the damaged, and the crossing branches of your rose, you will always end up with an improved rose at the end of it. So let me show you on the rose here what that looks like. All right, let's start with color. The color of good healthy growth and good healthy branches on a rose is green, red, or orange at this time of year. If you're looking for something that's less healthy, I'm going to try to get the camera to focus on this one here. And gray, black, dark brown, peeling, that's definitely not a healthy stem. So, and you can see at the very top of it, it actually returns to some semblance of a good color. At least it has some green in it. But down here, it's definitely split and cracked and gray, and I don't know if that's diseased or just fully dead or going towards dead, but I want to remove that to improve the condition of my rose. So I'll follow it down to a place where I think it still has a healthy color, and then I will prune right there. All right, now to damaged stems. This one is otherwise a healthy green stem, but you can see that along here it's become damaged. And because that's in a relatively tall part of the rose, and I don't want to allow the damage to persist there, but even behind it there, you can see that these branches have been probably rubbing together in the wind. And that brings me to the issue of crossing branches as well. Because if they're rubbing together in the wind, they're going to get seriously abraded there, and that's going to be something you're going to want to remove. So if you focus on what I showed you before, the dead and the diseased, this covers crossing and damaged branches. And if you remove all that, you can't help but improve the condition of your rose. So the third rule for pruning roses is to prune to an outward facing bud. I can't tell you how many times I've heard this, and I think it's probably one of the most confusing pieces of advice for pruning roses, because it really gets people self-conscious about what's an inward-facing bud, what's an outward-facing bud. It's something to learn, and so I'll show you on the rose here and I'll tell you my opinion of that rule. Alright, I'm on Fellowship here, and looking at this stem here, this is the center of the rose. Sorry, backing up here. This is the center of the rose, and looking at the stem here, you can see that this bud, or the leaf that's expressing, the new stem that's going to emerge there, is going towards the center of the rose. Now this rule says to prune to an outward facing bud. So this one here actually faces to the outside of the rose. And the theory is, and what they're trying to get you thinking here, is that instead of choosing one that's going to grow into the other foliage and branches of the rose and make it congested and get hard to get good air circulation and so on, that you should choose a bud like this one that is likely to shoot out this way and not congest up the center of the rose. And so if I were to prune above an outward facing bud, then my cut would happen right about here. And that's not a bad rule. Actually, anything that gets you thinking about looking at your rose, about what's its future growth going to look like, is probably a good thing. But don't be surprised if your rose does not follow your instructions, because it has every rose has a bud here, and then it has another one down here, there's another one down here, another one down here. It's going to do what it wants to. It may express one, or it may express all of those. So it's good to think about where your rose is going to send its next growth, but don't count on the rose following your instructions. The fourth rule or guideline about pruning roses says that this is what a finished pruned rose should look like. It should be pruned to anywhere between 3 and some people say 7 or 12 outward facing vase shaped form from 18 to 24 inches to the ground. And what do I think of this rule? Well, I think it's particularly harsh. I think this is actually an example of a rose that's being pruned a little bit on the low side. And also, it's a rule that is never intended. It was never even proposed by anybody to match all roses. So it might work well for a Floribunda or a hybrid tea that you're trying to spur on one large flush of blooms early in the season. But for most roses, this kind of a pruning is excessively harsh, particularly if you're talking about climbers, large shrubs, you know, species roses, old garden roses, once bloomers, all of those. This would be particularly hard. And even for hybrid teas, grandifloras, and floribundas, I don't prune this low on a routine basis, not unless I see some vigor problems and I want to prune it a little bit lower to spur on some new growth. Rule number 5 is a good one, an important one. It's to start with clean, sharp tools. And this is my tool of choice. This is a bypass pruner. It's a Felco, it's sharpened, and it's cleaned. I did a whole other video on how to sharpen and clean your bypass pruners, an important step. I use this tool for most of my cuts. Basically, if it's thicker than my finger, then I go to the saw, and I just use a little retractable blade saw like this one here, but the ones that the orchardists use are even nicer, make a cleaner cut, so you can go shopping for those. The importance of disinfecting it is that some of your roses may carry diseases, particularly viruses that can be spread by pruning cuts. So if you have one rose that has a disease, you go, you cut it, and then you move on to subsequent roses, you may be spreading disease between different roses. So definitely disinfect between your cuts, and also sharpen so that you get the nicest, cleanest cuts and you don't cause damage as you prune. Rule number 6 that's often quoted is to prune your pruning cuts on an angle. So instead of cutting straight across the stem, you're going to angle your cut, usually, or sometimes they say, even away from the bud that you're cutting. The idea of this rule, which I think is nonsense, by the way, is that it will deflect the rain, so that if you've got the angled pruning cut, that it will act like the roof of a house and the water will hit it and run off, and it will run off away from the bud that you're trying to protect, or the bud that's at the top of the stem. As I say, I think this is nonsense. When it rains, and it rains a lot here, it gets the whole area wet, and it dries at about the same rate either way, whether it's on an angle or whether it's straight. Whether that bud gets more wet or less wet during the rain makes no difference. The other one that's nonsense, just as a slight aside here, is to take glue and put them on those pruning cuts to try to seal them. Not only is that going to cost you time, but the idea of sealing pruning cuts has been thoroughly debunked in horticultural circles for a long time. So I'm going to put both cutting on angles and sealing those pruning cuts with glue or nail polish or any other notion that you have, as don't make simple things unnecessarily complicated. Keep your cuts straight, don't seal them, make your life easier, please. Final rule here that I'm going to talk about is to prune your rose for a pleasing shape and size, and to open it out. Those are more than rules, those are the guiding principles of pruning your roses, and it's good. That's what you want to do. Is a rose like this one that you see behind me, that's Fellowship, and it's a great rose, but it's grown in a little bit bushy. You can see in the center it's beginning to get a little bit congested. The overall shape of the shrub is not bad. It's kind of a vase shape, but it's getting to a height where if it grows another 2 or 3 feet this year, that the flowers will be above where I want them, and the overall shape and size of the shrub just needs to be maintained and managed for openness and cleanness. So I'm going to go ahead and prune this one here off camera, just to save us time, because it's going to take me maybe 15 minutes to prune this properly, and then I'll show you the result. All right, all finished here on Fellowship, and you can see that I did some things that follow the rules. I used clean pruning tools. I cut out the dead, diseased, damaged, and crossing branches first, and I did open out the whole shrub to more air circulation and more light in the center, and made a generally pleasing rounded shape for my garden. It may be noted at this point that what constitutes a pleasing shape will vary a lot in the genetics of the rose, as well as your own personal preferences. So I know that this is much improved for this season. I will get more flowers, better healthy shrub, so I know I've done the right job for it, but your own individual tastes may vary as to how low or how high you may want to leave your roses. Some of the rules I did not follow. I didn't pay any particular attention to inside or outward facing buds. I didn't slant my cuts. I didn't seal them with glue. So this is the results of my efforts here. If you want specific pruning tips on a particular type of rose, feel free to leave that in the comments below. I'll do my best for you. And yeah, if you have any comments, leave those below. Thank you so much for watching today.